When Panasonic creates the GH5S, they pretty much use a less is more approach because the camera is largely based on the GH5, but they took away the in-body image stabilizer. They put in a slightly larger but less resolution sensor, and then they added a few advanced features, including making the V-Log picture profile as a standard feature on the GH5S. So the result is a lighter camera that is specially targeting the higher-end video user, but at the same time for the average user, especially for people who shoot quite a bit of photos, the GH5 is still a better product for them because it is a more balanced product for a lot of users. Now, this time Panasonic is creating the S1H. While not exactly the same as the GH5S, in another way it is very similar. It shares a lot of components with the S1, but at the same time it also targeting the high-end video user. But instead of less is more, Panasonic do it the opposite way because the S1H have pretty much every feature that is available on the S1, and there are some additional changes and new features added to it. I have been using a pre-production S1H over the last 2 weeks or so. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my thoughts, my test results, and whether this camera is suitable for different group of users. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here. We have the Panasonic Lumix S1H here today, and it wasn't really that long ago when I did the Lumix S1 review, and that was like a 45 minutes review and probably the longest review I have ever done because there are so many features available on that camera. So it took me quite a bit of time to actually just trying to go through most of the important features. For the S1H, is more or less a S1 with more feature, more changes. So the problem is if I do it the same way, it could easily be a 1 hour or 1 hour plus review, which I can understand would be way too long for most of you guys. So what I'm going to do is that I can only assume people that watching this review would already either have watched my S1 review or know a lot about the S1. So I'm only going to focus on the main changes, the new features, the difference between the S1H and the S1. But if you don't really know much about the S1, I would highly recommend you to check out my S1 review first. I put a link below because in this video I'm going to skip over a lot of very cool features that's available on the S1H, but because they are carryover from the S1, so I'm going to skip them in this review. Okay, now let's start the video and let's talk about the body design and the build quality first. The body seems to be very similar between the S1 and S1H. They have the same high resolution EVF. They also both have a 24 megapixel full frame image sensor. But if you look a bit closer, then there is actually tons of difference between the two cameras. So I have a S1 here. This is the S1H and this is the S1. Putting the S1, S1H side by side, you immediately notice the S1H is quite a bit bigger than the S1. It is a bit taller, and if I turn it around, and then you will immediately notice the S1H, it has a extruded LCD screen, which also make the S1H quite a bit deeper. With the S1, I actually quite like the LCD screen design because I find it very easy to use when I'm using it to take photo. But I did hear a lot of complaints about the screen. A lot of you guys want to have the fully articulated screen. So now you finally have it with the S1H. You have the fully articulated screen, just like the GH5 or GH5S. One problem with the articulated screen when you are shooting video is that when you try to turn it around, the ports on the side, if you connect microphone or the HDMI or USB cable, the screen could easily blocked by some of the cable on the side. Panasonic did a pretty clever thing, is that they added another hinge to the LCD screen. So there is a little switch here, and you can now tilt the whole LCD screen out and up a little bit like this. So that means when you have the screen in this position, and even if you try to rotate the screen around, so there would be enough space to clear the HDMI port and the other ports, so your cable won't be blocked by the screen, or say the screen won't be blocked by the cable. So that is the very clever design. And not only that, that means if you are taking photos, if you just want to tilt the LCD screen up, you don't have to flip it out. You can just touch the switch and then you can just tilt the LCD screen out like this. So that is very good and easy. The only problem I noticed is that if you put the camera on a tripod, especially your tripod has a big base plate, then it would block the switch here. That means if you use it like that, then you cannot tilt it out after you mount it onto the base plate. So yeah, make sure if you do that, tilt it out first before you lock it onto the tripod plate. But apart from that, I just really like this LCD screen design. It's really good for videographer, even if you're using the port to connect to external HDMI recorder or monitor and other accessories. And it's also very good for photographer who want to just quickly flip the screen out when you are trying to take some photo from a lower angle. And also, just like other Panasonic camera, if you set the monitor to the LCD screen only, and when you flip out the screen, you can see it from here, and you flip the screen back like this, and it will automatically switch the display back to the EVF, even though if you set it to the LCD monitor only. And when you flip it out, then it will come back to the LCD screen. So this is a very little thing that Panasonic did, but that's just one of the things that make you enjoy shooting with a Panasonic camera. And behind the LCD screen, you can see that there are some vents here and also on the other side. So Panasonic put something they call a fan structure behind the LCD screen. So basically it's a heat sink with a fan, cooling fan, and also the fans on both sides. So when the fan is running, then it helps to push the hot air out from the camera to cool the camera down. And because of that, Panasonic has not put any time limitation on this camera when you are recording video, no matter what mode you are recording, 4K, 1080, 10-bit, whatever you're recording, there's absolutely no time limit on it. It's winter right here in New Zealand right now, so it's probably not a very good chance for me to test out whether the camera will overheat or not. But looking at some of the official information, the camera can withstand continuous recording even when the ambient temperature is around 40 degrees Celsius. If you're wondering, the fan on the S1H will be really loud. I would say the fan, when it's running at full speed, you can definitely hear it when you are filming in a very quiet place. Like for example, in this room, if the fan is running, I can hear it. But having said that, it is still quite quiet. In comparison, the fan on my Atmo Ninja 5 is a lot louder than this one. When the fan on the Ninja 5 kicks in, you can hear it very loudly even when you're shooting outdoor. But this one, you can hear it, but it's just barely hear it. And also on the camera, you have 4 different ways how you can set up the fan. There's an auto 1, auto 2, and there's a normal and slow. With the auto 1 setting, the camera will try to maintain the temperature of the camera as low as possible, so it will turn on the fan as soon as it detects the camera has raised above a certain temperature. And with the auto 2, then it will try to prioritize and just try to keep the camera quiet for as long as possible, so it will delay the turn on of the fan until the temperature has reached a certain level. Then you absolutely have to turn it on, then it will turn on the fan. With the normal setting, the fan will be running at normal speed all the time. So in that mode, you can hear the fan running when the camera is turned on. And the last setting is the slow setting. It's kind of similar to normal. The fan will be running all the time, but it will be running at a much slower speed. So the noise from the fan will be a lot lower compared to the normal setting. But despite the camera have the fan structure and fans on both sides of the camera, it is still a weather seal camera, and I have used this prototype camera quite a few times under rain, and the camera have absolutely no problem at all. The camera still have the very high resolution EVF just like the S1. It can go to refresh rate up to 120 frames per second. So very nice, very high resolution and very smooth. It is definitely one of the best EVF in the market today. You have the mic port, you have the headphone port, you have the full-size HDMI, you have the USB port, and at the front you have the flash sync port, which can also be used to sync the time code when you are shooting with multiple cameras. So this is one of the more advanced features that is available on the GH5S and now also available on this S1H. And below the flashing port, you can see this red button here. So yeah, this is the secondary record button, which allow you to start recording even though you are in front of the camera. And hiding right here, which you probably can't really see it here right now, but there's a teddy lamp here. So this is a red color light that would turn on when you are recording video. And there is another one right at the back here. These two teddy lamps will tell you when the camera is recording video, and also if something goes wrong, the teddy lamp will flash as well. So that is a very handy feature for you to know that whether the camera is recording, and if it stopped or have some problem, you notice it immediately. And I definitely find that the teddy lamp also with the front record button and the flip out screen all together make my life a lot easier when I was shooting the usual autofocus test. It just, I can see everything from the front easily and also control the start and stop of the recording easily from the front as well. If you look at the top of the camera, now you can see that it's a much bigger LCD screen compared to the one on the S1. The one on the S1 is actually not too bad at all, but in comparison, the one on the S1H is a lot bigger and it can display a lot more information. And also depends on what sort of shooting mode you are using right now and also what sort of setting you are using. The camera will display different kind of information when you are switching between different mode and settings. And this also applies to the rear LCD screen. As you may be able to see, when I'm switching different mode, it will display different kind of setting on the screen as well. If you want to use the adapter and use non-native lens on the S1H, you can store various information associated with each of the lens, for example, the focal length, the strength of the IS you want to apply, the image circle, and also the name of the lens. So this will be very handy for any filmmaker who is using a lot of non-native lenses. You can just store all the information on the camera, and that allows you to just change the setting quickly when you are switching lenses. The battery is the same big battery as the one used on the S1 and S1H. The factory figure is around continuously 2 hours usage. And over the last 2 weeks, my real world usage seems to quite agree with the factory figure. And just like the S1, S1R, you can also use the USB port to either charge the battery or power the camera as well. On this side of the camera, you have the memory card slots, so it has a dual memory card slot, but unlike the S1, S1R, it has both SD card slot, both are the fast SD card slot. It doesn't have any XQD card slot because this camera is really more designed for videographer, so it doesn't need the very high speed from the XQD card. But having said that, if you are intending to record internally 4K 10-bit 42 footage, you would definitely need some fast SD card, because when I was using my not really fast, I think they are like 95 megabit per second SD card to record the 10-bit 4K footage, the camera would stop recording after about 25 seconds or so because my card was way too slow. So definitely you will need some fast SD card if you want to do internal recording of the 4K 10-bit 42 footage. One thing I noticed immediately when I pick up the camera is that the power switch position has changed. With the S1, it was positioned here, which I have actually talked to Panasonic a few times, complained about it because I really don't like the position of the power switch here, which I find it not really easy to use. They have explained to me why they put the power switch here on the S1 and the S1R. But anyway, with the S1H, they put it back to the position that I like the most, which is right here where my index finger is sitting on. That allow me to turn on and turn off the camera very quickly and very easily every time I pick it up and drop it down. That is probably the best position for the power switch. And probably because of that, and they need to make some space between the power switch and the front dial here, you can see that this area around here near the power switch and the shutter button raised quite a bit compared to the S1. So this is another thing that makes the S1H a larger camera than the S1, but hold it in the hand, I just really like the position of the power button and also the shutter button. It just feels very comfortable. Another change that you may notice if you look at the top of the camera is that the video recording button is now positioned right here. On the S1, it is right at the back, which is in a quite hidden place. I think that was one of the signs that the S1 was not really designed as a video-centric camera, while the S1H, the video recording button, is now in a much easier to reach position. Okay, next let's talk about the autofocus system and the performance. I believe the autofocus system is largely the same as the one on the S1, but with one little but very important difference between the two cameras, which I'll talk about very soon. If you use it to shoot photo, especially when you're using one of the Panasonic lens, the autofocus speed is lightning fast and very accurate as well. It can also autofocus down to -6 EV, which is very good, even with the 24-105 f4 lens, which is not a very fast lens. I can still autofocus successfully when I'm shooting under very dark condition. When shooting video with continuous tracking, this used to be one of the biggest weakness for Panasonic camera, because with the earlier Panasonic camera, when you shoot video in continuous autofocus mode, it's quite slow and not really responsive and not very reliable. But if you are a GH5 user, you probably know that after a couple of firmware upgrade with the latest firmware, I think it's 2.4, the autofocus on the GH5 is already pretty good. And the same thing happens with their full frame S series camera as well. When I test the autofocus of the S1 with the 1.2 firmware, I found the autofocus performance become a lot better than with the previous firmware. The camera is now a lot more responsive, and more importantly, it's now very reliable. And if you have watched my version 1.2 firmware autofocus test video, you would have noticed that I did some comparison with the Sony a7 III, both running the latest firmware, and when the Panasonic I recording at 60 frames per second, the autofocus performance is actually pretty similar. Some people would even say it is better than the a7 III in terms of how responsive it is. So definitely Panasonic has put a lot of work in the autofocus system, and now the DFD system is become a lot better than what they used to be. So when I test the S1H, I got very similar result to the S1 with the latest firmware. When shooting at the normal frame rate, the autofocus, sometimes it is still a little bit slow, but it is very reliable, and also the transition is very smooth and looks very organic. If you compare it to the camera from some other brand, some other camera may have a faster response, but the transition doesn't look as smooth and as organic compared to the Panasonic. And that was when I was shooting at the normal standard frame rate. If I shoot in 60 frames per second, no matter I'm shooting in 1080p or 4K, the autofocus performance now improved quite a lot. The response is a lot faster. So that is very similar to what I experienced on the S1 with the latest firmware as well. But with the S1H, there is one more thing that this camera can do. That is, you can shoot in 120 frames per second with autofocus. That's in full HD resolution. So I did some comparison with this one side by side with a Z6, both with a native lens, and this is my test result. As you can see, the autofocus performance of the S1H when shooting at 120 frames per second is very good. Even when I'm running straight towards the camera, the autofocus system managed to track my movement pretty accurately and instantly. I've actually prepared a much longer version of the autofocus test video separately, so I put a link below. You can check out that video if you are interested in the S1H autofocus performance. So overall, while I probably won't declare the S1H as the class leading when it comes to video continuous autofocus tracking, but I definitely won't call it a weakness of the camera as well. If you have used any of the recent Panasonic camera, you will probably agree that Panasonic's in-body image stabilization technology is probably one of the best in the market right now, especially when you combine it with the lens. When you have the dual IS, the performance is exceptionally good. So with the S1H, the in-body image stabilizer, it can provide up to 6-stop effective image stabilization. And with the dual IS, it can provide up to 6.5 stop of image stabilization, even up to the telephoto end. Unfortunately, this time I haven't really get around to do some in-depth testing of this image stabilization system, but here is a photo I shot with the camera with the 24-105 kit lens. I shot this photo at the 24mm focal length, and the shutter speed was 2.5 seconds, and I was just basically standing there hand holding the camera. Look at the photo, it's still reasonably sharp even if you zoom in at 100%. So at 2.5 second shutter speed is more or less about 6 stops slower than the usually recommended 1/4 focal length shutter speed. And image stabilization also works very well when you are shooting video, which make it a very suitable camera if you want to do a bit of run and gun style shooting. And the camera also has a boost IS feature, which virtually turns the camera into like a virtual tripod or monopod. So here is some comparison footage I shot at about 150mm equivalent focal length using no image stabilization, dual IS and boost IS. You can see that the dual IS and the boost IS are both very effective at giving you a very smooth and stabilized video output. And just like the S1, the S1H also has a full-frame 24-megapixel image sensor, but they are not the same sensor, and there are two major differences. One is that the S1, the sensor has no low-pass filter at all, so that is optimized to give you the maximum sharpness, while the sensor on the S1H, it does have a low-pass filter in front of it. According to Panasonic, they do it to reduce the moire pattern on the video output. Another difference is that the S1H sensor now has the dual native ISO design, so that should give you better image quality when you are shooting at high ISO. The low native ISO is ISO 100 and the high native ISO is ISO 640, and if you are shooting in vlog, then the low native ISO is ISO 640 and the high native ISO is ISO 4000. We are going to do a bit of comparison test a little bit later on this review to show you whether this dual native ISO design has made any difference when it comes to the high ISO performance. The photo mode on the S1H is very similar to the S1. If you shoot it in the single autofocus mode, the maximum burst speed is 9 frames per second. If you shoot in continuous autofocus mode, the maximum burst speed is 6 frames per second, which is identical to the S1. One difference is that with the S1H, when you are shooting RAW file, the buffer size is around 60 photos. With the S1, it is around 90 photos, so it is quite a bit bigger. My guess is that because the S1 is using the XQD card, so it allows the camera to clear the image from the buffer to the card a lot faster than the S1H, so that gives you the bigger image buffer. But on the other hand, if you like to shoot in 4K or 6K photo mode, then with the S1 there is a limitation on how long you can shoot in. With the S1H, then there's no limitation at all, so you can pretty much shoot as long as your memory card and battery allow you to do so. I've done some testing of the camera generated JPEG shot at different ISO value, and here is a comparison of the JPEG I shot on the S1H, the S1, the Sony a7 III and also the Nikon Z6, all of them at the maximum ISO, which is 204,000. So these are all the JPEG generated by the camera at default setting. First, if we look at the JPEG from the Nikon, I think the Nikon's JPEG actually looks quite good in terms of the color and contrast. But if you zoom in, then you will see that the Nikon's JPEG, it lost pretty much all the fine details. The small letters in the photos are all barely visible. Looking at the S1, S1H image, they actually look very similar. The overall image quality, and if you zoom in, the amount of detail retained, the noise patterns actually looks very similar. They both have a bit of color cast. The S1 looks a little bit reddish, while the S1H has a little bit of green cast in it. But overall, I think the S1H color is a little bit more accurate, and also it seems to retain a little bit more contrast as well. If you look at the Sony a7 III JPEG, apart from some difference in color, it actually looks quite similar to the S1H. That is until I noticed the banding on the Sony JPEG, especially noticeable on the bottom half of the image, while the JPEG from the Panasonic has no banding at all. I guess that's because of a7 III's hybrid autofocus system, which means it has some face detection sensor on the image sensor. As I mentioned just a little while ago, one difference between the S1 and S1H image sensor is that the S1 doesn't have any low pass filter in front of the sensor, while the S1H does have a low pass filter. In theory, that means the image from the S1 would be quite a bit sharper than the S1H. So here are two photos I shot using exactly the same camera setting with the same lens, and also the camera on the tripod with timer mode, etc. just to make sure I get the maximum image quality from both of the camera. And as you zoom in, now it is at 400% zoom. You can see that the photo from the S1 does look a little bit sharper when you compare to the S1H. So the low pass filter does make a little bit difference in terms of the image sharpness. But remember, we are now looking at a side-by-side comparison photo at 400% zoom. When you take photo normally, I would really doubt you can notice the difference between the two cameras. So yeah, having a low pass filter would give you slightly not as sharp image, but in real world, I think the difference is barely noticeable. And just like the S1, the S1H can also shoot in high resolution mode. So if you put the camera on the tripod, and the camera will take multiple shots and then merge them together to give you a 96 megapixel raw file. One thing I just noticed when doing this review is that when you shoot in high resolution mode, the camera can only generate the raw file. It doesn't generate the JPEG file for you, because I was going to compare the high resolution file from the S1 and S1H, and then I noticed because I don't have a raw reader for the S1H, I couldn't really compare because I can't generate any high resolution JPEG, even though most of the user will be shoot in RAW when they shoot high resolution photo. But sometimes I think it would still be quite handy if the camera can just generate a high resolution JPEG straight from the camera. Okay, now let's start talk about the video recording on the S1H. The S1 is actually already a pretty good camera if you want to use it to record high quality video, especially if you got the Vlog upgrade firmware, which allow you to record 10-bit 4:2 Vlog footage internally. But if you compare to the GH5, GH5S, you definitely notice that a lot of the more advanced video features are not available on the S1. All those missing features now finally arrive on the S1H. The S1H can record 4K, including cinema 4K video footage, up to 60 frames per second, and there is no time limitation at all, so you can record it as long as your battery and memory card can last. The camera can also record 6K 10-bit footage at 24 frames per second, and that will be in a 3:2 aspect ratio. And you can record as long as you like. There's also no time limitation as well. While 3:2 aspect ratio output is probably a bit unusual, but at least with the 6K 3:2 aspect ratio footage, you can do quite a bit of cropping or panning with the 6K footage to generate some 4K output contents. And just like when you are shooting photos, when you're shooting video, the high ISO performance from the camera is also fantastic. Here are some sample footage I shot from ISO 6400 all the way to the maximum ISO. I would say up to ISO 51200, the output footage is still very clean and very high quality. And if you continue to increase the ISO, even if you go up to maximum ISO 204,000, I think the footage probably not very good quality, but it's still usable. Here are some comparison 4K footage that I shot on 4 different latest full frame camera. They're all 24 megapixel camera, which is the S1H, the S1, and also the Nikon Z6, and also the Sony A7 III. All the 4 cameras managed to capture pretty decent quality video at 5-digit ISOs. At the maximum ISO of 204,000, the Nikon Z6 seems to maintain a little bit better color information and contrast, but if you look a little bit closer, it's the Panasonic S1H that managed to maintain a lot of fine detail even at this ridiculously high ISO. Unlike the S1, which the Vlog picture profile is an optional upgrade, the S1H comes bundled with the Vlog straight out of the box. And also the bitrate for the 10-bit 4:2 footage for the S1H is 400 megabit per second, which is quite a bit higher than the S1, which is only 150 megabit per second. With the Vlog Panasonic claims that the S1H can capture 14 plus stop of dynamic range, so that is quite a bit higher than what the GH5 or GH5S can do. It's also higher than the EVA one, and according to Panasonic, is very similar to what their VariCam can do. So VariCam is their much more expensive cinema grade camera. So it is pretty impressive that the S1H can capture similar kind of dynamic range as the VariCam. Unfortunately, Panasonic has not sent me a VariCam for me to do some comparison tests, but I'm going to show you some comparison footage to see what the Vlog can capture compared to the standard profile on the S1H. And here is also a quick comparison footage I captured using the S1 and S1H, both using the Vlog color profile at ISO 51200. The details and noise captured by both cameras are actually very similar, But if you look at the whole picture, you can see that the footage from the S1H definitely can retain a bit better color information and also the contrast as well. The S1H also supports variable frame rate recording just like the S1, and it can go up to 180 frames per second at Full HD resolution. But unlike the S1, which has a more simplified option when you turn on the variable frame rate recording, which is pretty much the same as the one on the G9, the S1H has the more advanced option, which is more in line with the GH5 and GH5S. One thing I have complained in the past, both in my reviews and also when I talk to Panasonic directly, is that I would really want to see autofocus usable when you are capturing variable frame rate slow motion video. So the bad news is autofocus is still not possible when you are shooting in the VFR mode. But the good news is there is now a new video mode called HFR, which stands for high frame rate. When you are shooting in HFR mode, you will have full autofocus, and also it can record audio as well. So it is a little bit confusing, at least to me, because these two modes, VFR, HFR, they seem to be quite similar, but they are not exactly the same. And the most important thing is that the HFR does support autofocus and also can record audio. So that means finally you can now use a Panasonic camera to shoot some slow motion video with continuous autofocus. That means you can keep track of your target when you are shooting your slow motion video. I tested the autofocus performance when shooting at 120 frames per second, and the result is definitely very positive. The autofocus system can definitely track my movement a lot better. Even when I'm running at full speed towards the camera can still track my movement very quickly and very accurately as well. That is definitely a very encouraging news to Panasonic user. And for the S1H, that means if you want to shoot something with very good autofocus performance, consider shooting it at the higher frame rate, 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second, and then you get the best autofocus performance out of this camera. With the large amount of different video format that the camera can capture, it is a bit of pain when you have to go through that long list of different video formats to find the one you want. Panasonic did something that is pretty nice, is that when you are in the video format option list, you can now apply some filter to filter out the format that you want to use. You can specify a frame rate or codec or resolution, etc., and that would help you to narrow down the list of options that you want to use. So that make it a lot easier and faster for you to find the option that you want to use. And not only that, once you find the video format you want to use, you can also add it to something called My List. So that means you can just store your most frequently used video format in My List, and you can select them very quickly and easily. So the My List is definitely a very handy feature, and that saved me a lot of time when I'm testing the camera, because I have to frequently switch between quite a few different formats. So instead of having to go through the menu all the time, I can just go to My List and change them. But there is one little suggestion that I want to make to Panasonic to improve it, is that if you have used GH5, GH5S, you know that a lot of the video format, they are associated with a particular clock frequency of the camera. So that means if you want to shoot something at 25 frames per second, you have to change the camera's clock frequency to 25 frames per second before you can use it. And what that means is that when I go to My List and when I want to select something, quite often, because that's using a different clock frequency, it will gray out. The camera does tell me that I cannot select it because I'm running a different clock frequency. Sometimes with a lot of camera, it just gray out, doesn't tell you why. At least Panasonic does tell me why I need to do that. That means what I have to do is that I have to go to the setup menu, and then I have to change the clock frequency, and then I have to switch off the camera and then turn it back on, and then I have to go back to the video format selection menu, and then I can change it to the one I want. That's quite a few steps that I have to go through. I think it would be really great if Panasonic allowed the option that if you want to choose a video format that is currently not compatible with the camera's clock frequency that you choose, the camera will just offer you to, hey, do you really want to do that? If you want, then I will just change it and reset the camera for you immediately. So saving you time to go through different menu and then come back here. So Panasonic, if you can implement that, that would be awesome. Waveform display, vector scope, zebra pattern, they are all available on the S1H as well if you want to enable it. You can also enable a color frame so that when the camera is recording video, then you can see there's a border at the edge of the LCD screen. So that is just another indicator to let you know that the camera is recording video or not. As mentioned at the beginning of the review, this time Panasonic used quite a different approach when they create the S1H. It's based on the S1, but instead of doing less is more, they pretty much do more is more. They're adding more feature to the S1 to create this S1H. And the result is a very versatile camera that is suitable for a wide range of serious users. And I would even say this is the best, the most serious hybrid camera in the market right now. If you are a documentary or wedding videographer, the camera's excellent in-body image stabilizer and also the ability to shoot very high quality 4K 10-bit 422 footage internally make this a awesome camera for the run and gun style video shooting. And if you don't need to do run and gun style shooting, you can attach it to a lot of different accessories, the XLR video recorder, external monitor, external recorder, etc. to expand the capability of this camera. I imagine it will be an excellent B camera for large scale production. And if you are shooting a smaller production, it would be an amazing main camera. And for hybrid shooter that need to shoot quite a bit of photo as well as video, the still photo capability of this camera is excellent. It's pretty much as good as the S1 with only minor difference in terms of the image sharpness. But the difference, as you see in the earlier comparison photo, is almost not noticeable. That means the S1H is more than capable if you want to use it as a photo camera. And also, just like the S1, the ergonomic, the body design of this camera is absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of the best handling full frame camera that I have ever used, and also with a large display. And also I love this power switch. Just holding it, handling it is just like a dream. It's just fantastic when you are trying to use it to shoot either video or photos. The only downside if you compare to the S1, of course, is the slightly larger and heavier body, and also the price is a little bit higher. But if you ask me, is it worth the extra price or size? I think if you are a serious videographer, the answer is definitely yes. While some other camera manufacturer like Fujifilm, they have recently created some more video-centric camera that appears to have catch up with the GH5. Now, Panasonic with the S1H, they show us they are the real expert in this area, and they have really created a beast that other camera manufacturer will probably need to spend the next few years trying to catch up again.